I used to think the worst thing that could ever happen was losing my old house to some bogus HOA lawsuit, but man, that was just the opening act to a much darker show. This time, they didn't bother with warning letters or legal threats. They straight up busted down the door of my cabin, all because of something they called overwiring, which, believe me, is as ridiculous as it sounds. And the craziest part? The guest staying in my spare room at the time, let's just say Brenda, picked the absolute worst week to play tough and try enforcing anything. If you've ever tangled with HOA nonsense or had some clipboard warrior nitpick your life into chaos, I genuinely want to hear about it. Drop a comment with the pettiest thing they ever nailed you for. Anyway, I'm Dylan, 35 years old, and I've been working as a residential electrician for over 15 years wiring homes, setting up off-grid systems, installing battery backups, the whole deal, and I'm damn good at what I do. But being good with wires doesn't make you immune to a power-tripping neighbor with a rulebook and an agenda, and I learned that the hard way twice. I thought I'd gotten smart after the first disaster, figured I'd never let anyone mess with me like that again, but I underestimated just how far some people will go when they're obsessed with control. See, this wasn't my first rodeo with an HOA from hell. 3 years back, I lost everything: my house, my investment, all of it because I didn't know about some obscure regulation in their bloated rulebook. I'd transformed that place into a fully self-sustaining smart cabin, complete with solar panels, battery walls, an inverter rack, and a backup grid. But the HOA claimed it broke some vague clause about unauthorized energy infrastructure, and just like that, they tore it all down. I fought that nightmare for 8 long months. Burned through every bit of my savings on lawyers who promised results they couldn't deliver. And in the end, I still lost everything. I had to sell the house for less than what I even owed on it. I'll never forget that final day, standing alone in my workshop, carefully disconnecting each solar panel and backup system like I was tearing apart pieces of my own body. Every wire unplugged felt like another part of my soul being ripped away, and as I worked, those smug HOA reps just sat there in their sleek black SUVs, windows tinted, parked right in my driveway like vultures, watching the whole thing without an ounce of shame. They didn't even pretend to look away as I packed up years of blood, sweat, and innovation into a rusty rented U-Haul. At the time, I wasn't sure if I was being dramatic or if they really were that cruel and power-hungry, but looking back now, I realize I actually underestimated just how far they were willing to go. So when I moved to this quiet little suburb 6 months ago, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd finally found some peace. The cabin was tucked away at the edge of the development, far enough from the main drag that I figured I'd be left alone. This time, it had that perfect off-grid vibe, and I figured I'd gotten lucky. The previous owner was some old guy who'd lived there for over 20 years without a single issue at least. That's what I was told. I probably should have asked why he was so eager to sell after so long, but I was too eager to believe I'd found my sanctuary. Still, during the tour, little things started to nag at me, barely noticeable scratches on the conduit paint, sloppy patches covering old screw holes where mounts clearly used to be, and some suspiciously fresh paint trying to hide what looked like scars from removed electrical housing. The old man kept nervously glancing toward the main neighborhood during the tour, like he was expecting someone to show up and start asking uncomfortable questions, and in hindsight, that should have been my cue to walk away, especially when I saw the words HOA Managed Community buried in the fine print of the real estate listing. But I don't know, the place just felt right. Sometimes you step into a space and it hits you like it's meant to be yours, and this cabin had that vibe. It had good bones, solid foundational wiring, and a perfect spot out back where I set up my tools, a new breaker panel, and even converted an old shed into a full-blown repair station. And for 4 glorious weeks, it felt like I'd finally outrun the madness, like I could just work on my electrical projects, live quietly, and be left alone. That peace lasted exactly 28 days, because then she showed up. Brenda. That's what she told me to call her. But later I found out the entire neighborhood secretly referred to her as the H.O.A. witch. She was 55, a retired bank manager, who'd clearly never recovered from losing her little empire of authority, and now she funneled all that pent-up control energy into micromanaging every inch of the community. Always dressed in stiff business casual like she was headed to a board meeting, even just to walk her dog, and her eyes sharp, beady, constantly scanning. Always judging made your skin crawl if you caught her looking at you. The first time we met, I actually froze for a second because her stare was so intense it felt like she was trying to read my mind. And of course, the harassment didn't start with a bang, it trickled in slowly like poison. Brenda began what she called courtesy visits, dropping by uninvited to politely lecture me about so-called compliance issues. The first thing she flagged? My cabin's electrical box. She told me the color of my electrical box wasn't H.O.A. approved it. Needed to be painted their specific shade of dull gray, and claimed my exterior conduit lines were visually disruptive. Whatever that means. Apparently, the smooth, code-compliant installations I'd worked hard on offended her sense of uniformity. Next, she came after my backup power unit. I'd installed a fully weatherproof battery housing, clean as hell, professionally, grounded and built to every applicable code, and she still called it a violation. She stood there, arms crossed, staring at my outdoor inverter panel like it was a nuclear hazard, and said it disrupted the neighborhood aesthetic. I actually paused and thought, did she just say that? Out loud? About functional, safety certified electrical infrastructure? Who talks like that about equipment designed to keep homes powered during outages? But the real breaking point came when I stepped outside one morning and found this oversized violation notice slapped dead center on my front door. Bold red letters. Warning. Unpermitted electrical systems violate H.O.A. safety standards. Immediate. Compliance required. I just stood there, staring at that flimsy piece of paper taped over the result of weeks of precise planning, labor, and knowledge. My backup system, which probably cost more than Brenda's entire patio setup, reduced to some hazard by people who clearly didn't understand any of it. During one of her surprise drop-ins, Brenda actually had the audacity to say, "I once managed $1 million ledger. I know when a panel's non-compliant," which made absolutely no technical sense whatsoever, but she said it with that smug, overconfident tone people use when they want to sound like experts without knowing what the hell they're talking about. It actually took me a full minute to process how absurd Brenda's comment was. Like, what does managing $1 million ledger have to do with identifying code-compliant electrical panels? I started questioning myself, wondering if maybe I was just being overly sensitive. But come on, this was licensed, up-to-code work that met every regulation in the book. That night, something in me snapped, or maybe reawakened, and I finally did what I should have done 3 years ago. I sat down at my kitchen table, spread out every H.O.A. document I could get my hands on, and started reading like my future depended on it, because honestly, it felt like it did. All that buried trauma came rushing back, the lawyers who bled me dry, the endless court dates, the way my stomach used to twist every time I saw an official envelope in the mailbox. I read every word of those H.O.A. rules, hunting for loopholes, protections, anything I could use to shield myself from another disaster. And just like last time, it was a mess, convoluted, vague, written in that deliberately confusing legalese that makes regular people feel like they're breaking laws they never even knew existed. Then came the real kicker, a threatening letter, hand-delivered by Brenda herself, wearing that smug little smile like she was doing me a favor. It read, "After reviewing your electrical compliance history, the HOA board has determined that if immediate corrections to unpermitted systems are not made, the HOA may initiate stronger enforcement measures for safety compliance." I read that line over and over 10 times, at least trying to figure out what it even meant. What kind of enforcement did a homeowners association think they could carry out against a licensed electrical system? It didn't make sense. Not on the surface anyway, but something about the way she said it, the tone, the glint in her eyes, it short-circuited every wire in my body. Maybe I was overthinking it, or maybe not, but that night, for the first time in years, I double-checked every single door lock. And as I stood there staring at that vague threat letter, I felt that old fear creep up my spine like a familiar ghost, reminding me just how much I stood to lose again. It was the same crushing, helpless feeling I'd experienced when those lawyers swarmed my last property like vultures, picking apart everything I'd built until there was nothing left but dust and regret. I kept asking myself, should I just give in again, back down, make the changes they wanted, and pray they'd eventually leave me alone? Or was this finally the moment to stand my ground and push back, consequences be damned? I wasn't sure I had the strength to endure another drawn-out legal battle. But deep down, I also knew I couldn't keep running from this nightmare forever. Something had to break. I sat in my kitchen, staring at that ridiculous threat letter. Long after Brenda had strutted off, the echo of her heels crunching on the gravel still replaying in my head like a slow, cruel countdown. I couldn't let this happen again. I couldn't just roll over like last time. I was still wrestling with my options, trying to figure out whether I could afford a lawyer or if I'd have to rip out my own system when everything shifted. It was a Tuesday morning, about a week after Brenda's warning, when a knock came at my door. I opened it to find this sharp-looking guy mid-40s, maybe dressed in a crisp white button-down that looked custom-tailored, with a polished steel watch that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. He carried himself like someone who had real authority, not the petty kind that comes from HOA newsletters and clipboard patrols. He introduced himself as Garrett, and I immediately assumed he was another lawyer or maybe some rep from the county utilities office. But then he flashed a badge. "I'm a federal investigator," he said, "currently on administrative leave, working cases involving utility contracting fraud and infrastructure abuse. I need a quiet place to stay for a few weeks while some things get sorted out." And just like that, my reality twisted in a way I hadn't expected. I don't usually let strangers into my home, especially not while I'm neck-deep in neighborhood drama. But something about Garrett felt grounded. Maybe it was the steady eye contact, or the way he didn't try to sell himself, just told me what he needed. Or maybe I was just exhausted, worn down from fighting this HOA war alone. I agreed to let him stay in the guest room, but not without hesitation. Later that night, when things had quieted down, I found myself opening my laptop and searching. His name online, nothing. No LinkedIn, no social media, no news hits. No digital footprint whatsoever. And that's when I felt the chill creep in again. No LinkedIn profile. No news mentions. Not even a blurry ID photo buried in some government directory. It was either the cleanest cover I'd ever seen, or Garrett really was exactly who he claimed to be, a federal investigator who is dangerously good at disappearing when necessary. I wanted to ask why he picked my cabin of all places, tucked away at the edge of a quiet suburb with just enough room for tools and paranoia, but I didn't. Maybe I was afraid of the answer, or maybe I just didn't want to mess up what felt like a lucky break. Looking back, I still can't believe I said yes that fast, but sometimes your gut just knows. And honestly, the idea of having someone with actual authority around made me feel safer, like maybe Brenda would finally think twice before marching onto my property again with more of her compliance visits. Garrett moved into the spare room that same afternoon, and at first, it felt like a welcome change he kept to himself, mostly typing on his laptop or making quiet phone calls behind closed doors, never once commenting on how I ran my home, never once eyeing my breaker panel like it was a ticking bomb. But on his second day, something happened that made it very clear this was more than just a convenient housing arrangement. I was venting to him, flipping through the ridiculous stack of H.O.A. violations Brenda had shoved into my life circuit. Housing complaints, exposed cabling accusations, threats about non-standard enclosures, just trying to unload the stress, when suddenly he leaned in and got very interested. "Dylan," he said, squinting at one of the pages, "when did you get these?" So I walked him through the timeline: Brenda's visits, the escalating reports, the final warning letter. And as I spoke, Garrett pulled out this sleek magnifying lens and started studying the documents like they were forensic evidence. After about 20 minutes of dead silence, he tapped the corner of one page and said, "These PDFs were altered recently. See this digital signature on the electrical inspection form? It's forged." I actually froze. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, half expecting he was just exaggerating to sound impressive, but his expression didn't change. He was dead serious. And just like that, everything I thought I understood about my little H.O.A. nightmare shifted into something far bigger and far more dangerous. My mind immediately jumped to those TV dramas where someone pretends to be an expert until they get publicly exposed as a fraud. Was this one of those moments? I mean, was I really supposed to believe Brenda went so far as to forge a document just to hit me with a violation over how I wired an exterior breaker box? But then Garrett pulled out his phone and calmly walked me through one of his previous investigations, showing me a detailed case study filled with forensic markers that confirmed document tampering beyond any doubt. He broke down the metadata, the altered digital signature, even the mismatch in timestamp sequences. The guy knew his stuff. That's when the full weight of it hit me. Brenda wasn't just an overzealous neighbor with too much time and a control complex. She was actually breaking federal laws to harass me. Garrett listed them off like he'd seen this 100 times before: document tampering, fraud, abuse of authority, misrepresentation of compliance standards. The charges kept stacking up. As he dug deeper into the HOA's paperwork, I didn't know whether to feel vindicated that my instincts had been right all along, or terrified that I'd somehow become the target of someone willing to commit actual crimes just to destroy my self-sufficient electrical setup. It still didn't fully make sense. Why me? Why this much effort? But Garrett seemed convinced there was something more at play, something that went beyond petty revenge or uniform paint colors. That night, after he turned in and the house went quiet, I sat alone at my kitchen table with the HOA rulebook spread out again, but this time, I wasn't looking for clarity. I was looking for cracks. I wanted to see exactly where she'd twisted the rules, manipulated the language, weaponized vague phrases to corner me into submission. And the more I read, the clearer it became. These weren't rules. They were traps carefully written to confuse, restrict, and control. It had never really been about the wiring or backup batteries or conduit paint. It was about power: who had it, who didn't, and who got to decide whether your home stayed standing. The realization hit me like a jolt through a faulty ground line. This wasn't a compliance issue. This was someone using the illusion of order to play God over people's lives. I closed the rulebook and just sat there in the dark, the familiar knot tightening in my stomach, the same one I'd felt 3 years ago when I was forced to dismantle my life piece by piece. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't alone. I had someone on my side who actually understood how these people operated, someone who could see through the smoke and mirrors and recognize the system for what it really was. The next few days passed in an eerie calm. Too calm, Brenda didn't show up for her usual unsolicited courtesy visits, and for a brief moment, I wondered if maybe seeing Garrett calm, official, quietly observant had actually rattled her. But then the formal letter arrived, hand-delivered like clockwork, only this time she didn't knock. No phony pleasantries. No fake neighborly concern. She walked up like she owned the entire block, clipboard in hand like a gavel, ready to pass. Judgment. "I need to inform you," she announced in that clipped, self-important tone, "that your temporary guest appears to be operating a non-permitted technical service. HOA requires full disclosure of any on-site business or mechanical activity." She held out an official-looking envelope like it was a subpoena. I wish I could say I stayed calm, played it cool, but come on, who wouldn't snap when faced with that level of bureaucratic madness? "Brenda," I said, holding my voice steady as best I could, "this is my house. I don't need your permission to have a friend stay over." But she just smiled that cold, smug smile and started tapping the envelope against her palm like she was waiting for me to beg. "According to HOA Covenant Section 12.4, she said, "all occupancy changes must be pre-approved to maintain community safety standards. Your guest has until Friday to provide proper documentation or he'll need to vacate the premises." I stood there stunned. That couldn't be legal, could it? Even an HOA couldn't dictate who you let into your own home, right? But the way she said it, so smooth, so matter-of-fact, made me hesitate, made me doubt. Maybe I should have told her to shove it and slam the door in her face, but I didn't get the chance. Because that's when Garrett stepped out onto the porch. Garrett stepped out onto the porch, still in that perfectly pressed white shirt, and gave Brenda a stare so cold it felt like the temperature around us dropped 10 degrees, an absolute freeze frame of authority. "Unauthorized inspection attempts on private electrical systems could violate multiple codes," he said calmly, his voice low but razor sharp. "Ma'am, you really want to push this?" I didn't know if he was bluffing or not, but judging by the way Brenda's face twitched and her grip tightened around that envelope like it was a holy relic, she wasn't prepared to call his bluff. She took a small, involuntary step back and hissed, "You'll regret not cooperating, Mr. Henderson. This was your last chance." That sentence sent a jolt straight through my spine. And with that, she turned and stormed off. But not before pulling out her phone and snapping multiple photos of my porch, my breaker panels, conduit lines, and every inch of visible external wiring. I stood there watching her like I was in a dream, realizing far too late that those weren't just for H.O.A. documentation. She was building something. A case, a file, a dossier, who knows? Whatever it was, it had nothing to do with community safety and everything to do with leverage. That moment, the look of pure rage twisted across her face as she walked away, was when it finally hit me. This wasn't about an overzealous neighbor anymore. This was a calculated takedown. And sure, having Garrett around felt like protection, like I had a shield in a war I never asked to fight, but a part of me couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, I'd painted an even bigger target on my back by letting him in. The escalation began the very next morning. I woke up to the unmistakable sound of power tools buzzing outside my window, and when I looked out, I saw two guys in utility uniforms mounting a huge security camera to the top of a pole. Nothing unusual, until I noticed exactly where it was. Pointing, not at the street, not at the neighborhood entrance. Right at my outdoor electrical unit, fixed directly on the workshop breaker system I'd installed myself. I stepped outside and asked them what they were doing, and one of the workers handed me a copy of a work order, stamped and signed by the HOA, requesting enhanced surveillance of problem properties for community safety purposes. Problem properties, that's what they were calling my home now. Maybe I was being paranoid. maybe I was overthinking, but something about the way that camera lens glared down at my wiring made it feel like a sniper scope. That camera made my skin crawl every time I stepped outside. It wasn't just some discreet neighborhood security feature, it was one of those oversized, motorized units that tracked motion in real time, swiveling and adjusting its focus with a low, mechanical whir that cut through the quiet like a dentist's drill. The sound alone was enough to make your shoulders tense, but the worst part was knowing it was locked on me. Every time I walked out to check the circuit panel, it followed. I started changing my routines, taking the long way around to my workshop, checking the mailbox from the window instead of the porch, avoiding that side of the yard altogether just to feel like I wasn't being hunted in my own home. Garrett noticed it too. And the look on his face when he saw the lens tracking me, it wasn't just concern, it was disbelief. "That lens is fixated on your circuit panel, Dylan," he said, voice low. "That's not safety, that's surveillance." One afternoon, he calmly walked outside with a towel and casually draped it over the lens like it was no big deal. Less than 5 minutes later, my house phone rang. Brenda, of course furious, demanding that we remove the obstruction to community safety monitoring equipment. And in that moment, I actually had to stop and think, what's the difference between security and surveillance? Then it hit me: security cameras look out for problems. This thing was watching me like I was the problem. But that wasn't the end. The next escalation came fast. It was Wednesday, around 2 p.m., sun shining, birds chirping, and then click. My entire house went dark. No warning, no storm, no street work, just sudden silence. I called the utility company, expecting some kind of grid-wide explanation. But instead, they told me there had been an HOA requested utility isolation due to an unauthorized grid connection. I couldn't even process it at first. Your system was flagged as non-compliant, they said, so the HOA ordered it cut off. 6 hours I sat in a powerless house, long enough for the food in my fridge to spoil and for my computer to lose every unsaved schematic I'd been working on. When the lights finally flickered back to life, I sat in the dark kitchen, fists clenched, and felt that same gut punch of helpless rage I'd thought I'd left behind 3 years ago, the kind that makes you want to scream, but also reminds you just how vulnerable you really are when people with power decide you don't belong. 3 years ago, when the lawyers began circling my old place like sharks in tailored suits, I remember the same suffocating feeling creeping in, and this time, as the power flickered back on, I instinctively reached for my tools, wanting to check connections, trace circuits, do something to feel in control. But I froze, staring at the panel, wondering if it was even worth the fight. Was I just inviting another legal nightmare? Was this just more bad luck? Or something more deliberate? The coincidences were piling up fast, and both Garrett and I had stopped believing in chance. That's when we made the decision to dig deeper into the HOA's operations. Garrett had this uncanny way of reading documents, not just the text, but the silences between the lines, like he was trained to find the things people were trying to hide. And what we uncovered, well, I wish I could say I was shocked, but honestly, it just confirmed what my gut had been screaming for weeks. Buried inside the HOA's financials were transactions that didn't add up literally. "Here," Garrett said, tracing a line with his finger, $6,000 billed for electrical upgrade labor during a month when no licensed contractor ever visited the property. Another entry flagged transformer testing, but the HOA didn't even have any underground transformers. It was a paper trail of nonsense, and we were following it straight into the heart of something much bigger than wiring violations. And then, right in the middle of all this, I had a strange encounter with Mr. Peterson, the quiet older guy who lived 3 doors down. As I checked my mailbox, He stopped and leaned in slightly, speaking in a low voice like we were under surveillance. "Brenda's gotten too bold lately," he said, eyes darting over his shoulder. "Not everyone on the board agrees with what she's doing to you. I joined to fix broken sidewalks, not to watch her break people." And before I could ask anything else, he walked off. That single sentence echoed in my head as Garrett spread our findings across the kitchen table like a detective unveiling a conspiracy. "This is our smoking gun," he said. "Financial fraud, document tampering, and now targeted harassment. She's not just a nuisance, she's operating a campaign of illegal behavior, and we've got the evidence to prove it." And I just sat there, not sure whether to feel relieved that I wasn't imagining it all, or terrified at how far Brenda was willing to go, because now we weren't just exposing an HOA bully. We were poking a very real bear she was breaking. Actual laws just to mess with me, and that realization came with a whole new kind of fear, because people willing to commit crimes for control don't stop when they're caught. They escalate. Looking back, I should have known that cornering someone like Brenda wouldn't end things. It would only make her more dangerous. The anonymous warning arrived Thursday night, sent directly to Garrett's secure federal email, and the message was chilling in its simplicity. She's going way too far with this. Not everyone on the board agrees with what she's doing. You need to be careful. No name, no signature, just a digital whisper from someone clearly inside the HOA who is watching it all unravel from the shadows. Garrett showed me the message, and I could see it rattled him more than he let on. "Looks like someone inside's watching Brenda lose control," he said, his voice low, eyes locked on the screen. "This goes deeper than power lines, Dylan." And the way he said it, with that quiet certainty of someone who'd seen too many dark corners of the system, made my stomach twist. That night, I had the most vivid, unsettling dream. I was back in my old cabin, standing in my workshop as it burned to the ground, flames curling around my solar panels, melting the battery banks, turning everything I'd built with my own hands into smoking ash, while HOA officials in black suits calmly stood around with clipboards, jotting notes as if they were auditing the destruction. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, and the first thing I did was grab a flashlight and walk outside to check my panels, half expecting to find them sabotaged, half just needing to know they were still mine. The security camera clicked, and word as it tracked me, that red LED blinking steadily like some kind of digital eye, watching, recording, judging. I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring back at that blinking light, thinking about how easy it had been for them to cut off my power before no warning, no hearing, just gone. What if they did it again, at night, while I was asleep, while Garrett was away? And then came the whispers, rumors carried by nervous neighbors, people who suddenly wouldn't make eye contact, who only spoke in hushed tones when Garrett and I walked by. Word was spreading fast that Brenda had been telling people she had a plan to permanently solve the Dylan and Garrett problem. Permanently solve. That phrase stuck in my head like a cracked circuit, ominous, final, and terrifyingly vague. The tension had settled into my skin like static, subtle but impossible to ignore. It was too casual to be normal and too calculated to be coincidence. I never set out to turn my peaceful home into a battleground. All I wanted was to work on electrical systems and live quietly, minding my own business. But she turned it into a war zone with cameras aimed at my property, sudden power outages, and an endless stream of official-looking harassment letters. It felt less like a neighborhood dispute and more like a siege led by someone who believed her H.O.A. title gave her unchecked power. This wasn't about zoning anymore. This was psychological warfare delivered through paperwork, surveillance, and a relentless campaign designed to grind us down slowly. That night, surrounded by the growing pile of evidence we'd collected, I found myself at a crossroads. Stay silent and hope she'd eventually lose interest, or take a stand and finally put an end to this madness. Deep down, I already knew people like Brenda don't stop on their own. They keep pushing, escalating, until someone finally pushes back. That Friday morning began with an eerie calm that felt more like a warning than a relief. I was in the workshop splicing wires into a backup load panel, trying to stay focused when the wind picked up outside. Normally nothing unusual for late autumn, but there was something off about the way it moved through the trees, something that made me stop and listen. My cabin door creaked softly on its hinges, and as I looked toward the house, I saw Garrett standing at the kitchen window, staring back at me. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, like he felt it too. The whole morning felt unnaturally still, like the heavy silence before a violent storm breaks. Even the birds had gone quiet. Instinctively, I checked the locks on both doors twice. I hadn't done that since the early days of Brenda's threats. "This feels wrong," I muttered, wiping the sweat from my palms despite the cool air. Garrett came over from the kitchen, his face drawn and serious, and I could tell we were both bracing for something we couldn't quite name, but knew was already in motion. "They're not going to ask for permission this time, are they?" Garrett said quietly, eyes fixed on the empty street like it was a battlefield waiting to erupt. I couldn't tell if it was gut instinct or just the lingering paranoia from weeks of harassment, but something about the atmosphere felt electric charged, like the seconds before a thunderstorm crashes down. We both sensed it, that creeping. Certainty that the next move wouldn't be subtle. And then, around 11:30, it came not as a knock, but as a series of sharp, thunderous pounds that rattled the entire cabin. I peered through the window and saw her, Brenda, standing like a general with two men in HOA maintenance uniforms flanking her. They clutched clipboards with manufactured authority, their serious faces adding to the illusion. Behind them, a utility-branded pickup truck idled with orange cones neatly set out and a voltmeter rig mounted on the back, official looking enough to intimidate, but not quite legitimate. Brenda, ever the picture of smug professionalism, in her pressed slacks and smug half-smile, practically radiated triumph. This wasn't one of her typical surprise drop-ins. This was different. This was an ambush draped in policy. "Dylan Henderson," she announced as I opened the door, reading from a document that looked suspiciously formal. "We're here to perform a mandatory electrical safety inspection under H.O.A. Compliance Code 14.7. All properties with multiple violations are subject to immediate review." I just stared, momentarily speechless. Code 14.7? Brenda, I've never heard of that, and you're not a licensed inspector. None of this gear has gone through official utility approval. This isn't protocol. But her cold smile didn't falter as she signaled her clipboard-carrying enforcers forward. "Recent updates to HOA regulations give us administrative enforcement authority over all unregistered electrical setups," she said smoothly. My hand drifted toward my phone, thumb hovering over the emergency call button, but I froze. I remembered too clearly how unhelpful emergency services had been. Last time, how their delay had allowed all this to spiral. And now, standing in the doorway with that smug face inches from mine and faux official backup looming behind her, I realized I was on my own again. The police had all but shrugged 3 years ago when the HOS army of lawyers rolled in with neatly stamped paperwork, and I knew it calling them again now would be a dead end. So what was I supposed to do? Trust the very system that had failed me before, or put my faith in the man sleeping under my roof, a man with a federal badge and a past he refused to talk about? When I refused to let them in, Brenda's expression cracked her smug confidence, snapped into open fury. "If you won't comply voluntarily," she snapped, "we're authorized to conduct the inspection regardless. This is about community safety, not your personal preferences." That's when it hit me. She wasn't bluffing. She genuinely believed she had the legal authority to storm into my workspace and dismantle whatever she didn't understand. And maybe I should have called the police right then and there, but everything was moving too fast, like a train I could see but couldn't stop. A part of me still couldn't accept that she would actually go this far. Was I underestimating her? Again? Or was she genuinely as unhinged as she now appeared? Then she nodded at the maintenance workers, and without hesitation, they moved toward my side workshop door, the one that opened directly into the inverter bay where all my sensitive equipment was housed. The same door I'd used to haul in. Heavy parts, the one that led straight into the heart of my electrical setup. I heard them murmuring something about structural integrity concerns and emergency access protocol, quietly justifying the force they were about to use. I stood there frozen, heart pounding in my ears as one of the guys tapped a crowbar against his boot like a signal. Garrick still hadn't moved, and neither had I. This wasn't a scare tactic anymore. This was about to turn physical. They were about to break down the door I had built myself after losing everything at my last house. A solid oak frame, reinforced hinges, high-grade deadbolt, the kind of door you build not just to protect equipment, but to protect your future. And now, they were going to destroy it. All because one woman couldn't stand the idea of losing control. Then came a sound I'll never be able to unhear: the raw, splintering crunch of a crowbar punching through the latch, followed by the violent explosion of wood and metal as my custom-built door was ripped open like it was nothing. No attempt to unlock it. No request for a key, just brute force and destruction. The crash echoed through my workshop, shaking the walls and sending screws, wires, and wooden shards flying across the room. In that instant, all the air seemed to leave my lungs. It was more than just a break-in. It was a full-body flashback to the day 3 years ago, when the lawyers came with their stamped eviction papers and stripped me of everything. That same sick, helpless feeling crawled back into my chest, now amplified by the fact that it was happening again, someone smashing their way into what I had painstakingly rebuilt, shattering both the door and a sense of safety behind it. She didn't even try to knock, I muttered, watching delicate electrical components scatter across the floor like debris from a bomb blast. Brenda had found a way to wrap her illegal, outrageous behavior in the cold camouflage of paperwork and fake authority. But the worst part wasn't the shattered door or the violated space, it was the look on her face. That smug, self-satisfied expression as she stepped over broken surge protectors, scanning the panels like she had any clue what she was looking at. "I have visual authority," she declared, waving her clipboard like it was a badge, marching deeper into the chaos she'd caused. "I am the H.O.A. authority here, and this property falls under my jurisdiction." And there I stood, watching her walk directly into an active workspace, surrounded by live wires, open breaker boxes, and high-voltage components, completely unaware of the danger she was stepping into. She flinched slightly when a spark snapped from an exposed inverter terminal, but quickly straightened up and pressed on, too drunk on her imagined power to recognize just how far she had crossed the line. I've shared stories like this before people, letting tiny scraps of authority blind them to the reality of their actions, but I never thought I'd find myself in the middle of one. And now, standing there in the wreckage of my doorway, with her clipboard raised like a weapon and my life's work lying in ruins at her feet, I realized I wasn't just witnessing the abuse of power, I was the target of it. As Brenda rifled through my electrical equipment like she was leading some kind of official inspection, I was hit with a strange cocktail of rage, disbelief, and a quiet building anticipation. It was like watching someone blindly reach for a high-voltage panel with wet hands and no idea what it could do. Dangerous, reckless, and bound to end badly. I stared at the splintered door behind her and the chaos she'd created, and the question burned in my mind: do I call the cops again? and hope for a different outcome, or do I just let her keep walking straight into the mess she was making for herself? Because that's exactly what it felt like watching someone dig their own grave with each arrogant, unauthorized step deeper into my space. Brenda moved further into the workshop, stepping over cable housings and electrical meters with that same dismissive air, completely unaware of the danger all around her. I slowly began backing up, not out of fear, but with deliberate calculation, every step measured. Somewhere behind me, I could feel Garrett's presence, probably watching silently from the kitchen doorway, waiting for the moment to unfold. "Keep walking, lady," I whispered through clenched teeth, gripping the jagged edge of a broken surge protector so tightly it left ridges in my palm. "You're almost there." And then she paused, standing directly in front of the main fuse cabinet, unaware, unprotected, and just feet from where Garrett was waiting, perfectly still in the front hallway. She had no idea that she had just walked into something far bigger than an HOA power play or an electrical code violation. Brenda had crossed a line, not just legally but irrevocably, and now she stood at the edge of something she couldn't control or even understand. I watched her from the wreckage of my doorway, heart pounding but steady, knowing that whatever happened next wasn't up to me anymore. Standing there in the shattered doorway, I knew without a doubt that this was the moment everything from here would change, one way or another. But I couldn't tell if that change would swing in my favor, or if I was about to watch my entire life crumble for a second time. About 10 minutes after Brenda smashed her way into my workshop, the police finally arrived. 10 minutes that felt like an eternity. The sound of that confrontation must have echoed far beyond the property line because no one had called them, at least not from my side. 2 officers showed up, looking tired and annoyed, the kind of expressions that said they'd expected another petty neighborhood spat, not a full-blown HOA invasion. The sight of their uniforms walking up my driveway made my stomach twist into knots, not out of guilt, but out of sheer uncertainty. What were they going to see when they walked in? An innocent homeowner under siege, or just another troublemaker in a domestic dispute? They found me standing inside the side workshop, just beyond the wreckage next to a half-destroyed breaker box and what was left of a conduit line torn from the wall. The place was a mess, not from neglect, but from a deliberate intrusion. And here I was, surrounded by ruined equipment, a door that no longer locked, and the HOA president knee-deep in my wiring as if she owned the place. Not to mention, a federal investigator sleeping in my guest room just feet away from the chaos. The younger of the 2 officers, barely out of training by the look of him, scanned the room with wide, skeptical eyes. He clearly hadn't been briefed for anything like this. Then he turned to me, notepad in hand, and said, "Sir," in a tone that made it clear the next few minutes would either expose the truth or bury me under someone else's version of it. "Are you the property owner here?" the officer asked, his tone clipped and professional. "We've received reports of an electrical dispute and possible squatting on abandoned infrastructure." I blinked, trying to process the absurdity of what he'd just said. How was I supposed to explain any of this without sounding completely unhinged? I took a breath and tried to stay calm. "Officer, this is my home, my legally permitted electrical workshop. That woman broke down my door without any legal right to be here," I said, gesturing toward Brenda, who still stood there gripping her clipboard like it was a holy relic. The officer gave me a skeptical look, the kind you give someone who's already lost you at legally permitted, and I could practically see him filing this under crazy homeowner drama. But then he turned to Garrett, and everything shifted. "Sir, we've also received a report of someone impersonating a federal officer. I'm going to need to see some identification." My heart caught in my throat. I watched Garrett closely, studying his face for any twitch, any sign that the story he'd told me, the badge, the cases, the quiet confidence, had all been a lie. Was this it? Was the whole federal agent act some elaborate con, and had I let him into my home, my life, on a lie? I was seconds away from losing complete control when Garrett calmly reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather badge wallet. He didn't flash it nervously or try to rush past the moment. No, he unfolded it slowly, methodically, like someone who had done this thousands of times. His voice, steady and low, broke the silence. "You might want to take notes," he said, presenting his credentials with precision. And just like that, both officers straightened, their skeptical expressions replaced with immediate attention. It wasn't just any badge, this was the real thing. Official federal credentials, complete, with ID card and agency insignia. "Special Agent Garrett Morrison," he said, handing it over for inspection. "Currently on temporary leave. Former lead investigator on multiple federal energy fraud and infrastructure laundering operations." For a moment, the entire room seemed to shift. Brenda's smirk faltered. The officers exchanged glances, and I just stood there, reeling from the quiet authority that Garrett had just dropped like a sledgehammer. "I'm here as a civilian," he added, calm as ever, "but I've been documenting everything." "Guest," Garrett continued, his voice steady, "but I've been documenting what appears to be fabricated electrical compliance reports, falsified HOA inspection logs, and fraudulent budget entries for equipment that doesn't even exist." The shift in the room was instant and undeniable. The officers, who just moments earlier seemed moments away from writing me off, now stood straighter, more alert, no longer treating Brenda as the authority figure. And I watched it hit her like a slow-moving train she never saw coming. First came the disbelief, her jaw literally dropped open in cartoonish shock. Then, panic, her eyes darting wildly between Garrett's badge, the officers' suddenly stone-cold faces, and the growing pile of evidence now taking shape in my torn-apart workshop. No, that's impossible. Who the hell are you really?" she demanded, her voice cracking for the first time, brittle and uneven like the exact moment when decades of bluffing hit a wall. I imagined that same voice faltering when the audits caught up with her a decade ago, and now here it was again, unraveling in front of an audience she couldn't control. But Garrett wasn't finished. He calmly pulled out his phone and tapped the screen, playing back audio recordings, clear conversations where Brenda could be heard planning to fudge compliance numbers to hide stolen funds, talking openly about manipulating inspection logs. Then came video footage, grainy but damning, showing her ordering my workshop door to be forced open without a single shred of legal authorization. In the background, you could even hear the voltage alarm screaming the moment the door was breached. And Garrett kept going. He unrolled blueprints across my damaged workbench, marked up plans filled with forged permit stamps. He connected a portable speaker and played phone calls that left no room for misinterpretation. Then he handed over a thick folder, its tab labeled in bold federal lettering, FRAUD evidence log. Inside, pages and pages of detailed documentation, financial reports, altered inspection forms, and line-item budgets for phantom equipment, all of it meticulously compiled during his quiet weeks under my roof. One of the officers, flipping through the stack, let out a low whistle. "Holy hell," he muttered, unable to hide his shock. I just stood there in stunned silence, watching the whole thing unfold. This wasn't some random neighborhood feud anymore. This was something else entirely, something criminal, something massive, and finally, something I wasn't alone in fighting anymore. This wasn't just a federal agent who'd accidentally stumbled into my neighborhood. Drama Garrett had been building a full-scale case against Brenda from the very beginning. What I thought was a personal housing dispute had become the smoking gun the documented abuse of power needed to expose a much larger scheme connecting this HOA to a sprawling energy contracting fraud. Garrett explained everything to the officers, calm and deliberate, while Brenda stood frozen, her expression melting from confusion to horror as the truth unfolded. "Brenda isn't just some overreaching HOA president," he said. "She's part of a coordinated network using homeowners associations to launder funds through fake electrical upgrades and fabricated compliance projects." I stood there torn between relief and unease. Was I just a pawn in Garrett's investigation, bait dangled in front of a shark, or had I lucked into the exact help I needed at the exact right time? Either way, I couldn't take my eyes off Brenda. As the realization hit her, I wish I could fully capture her face in that moment. First disbelief, then defiance, then that desperate, scrambling panic when she finally understood her empire of fake authority had just collapsed. Everything, the smug tone, the clipboard, the fake codes and forced inspections evaporated the moment real law enforcement entered the room. "Brenda," I said, my voice finally steady, "you don't get to override every code just because you carry a clipboard and wave around a fake permit." And then click. The sound of the handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists was pure, cathartic justice. I didn't even realize I was still gripping the broken surge protector in my hand like a hard-earned trophy. That sound, the metal bite of accountability, took me back to my old cabin. Back to the days when people like Brenda walked away unscathed with briefcases full of loopholes and legal threats. But not this time. This time, there were real consequences for real crimes. And as they cuffed her beneath the sign that read "High Voltage, Authorized Personnel Only," it felt poetic, like the universe finally wiring justice into the walls. Watching Brenda transform from smug dictator to panicked criminal in under 5 minutes was the most satisfying thing I'd seen in years. Ironic, really, how unauthorized her entire career had just become in the span of a single afternoon. Not just arrested, completely undone. All the trauma I'd carried from losing my last home, every moment of fear, helplessness, and rage I'd felt while enduring her relentless harassment, it all finally felt like it meant something, like it had led to this moment of real, undeniable justice. Watching her ego implode under the weight of actual consequences was a kind of closure I hadn't dared hope for. The so-called maintenance crew? They dropped their multimeters like they were made of live wire and bolted the moment those handcuffs appeared. The utility truck that once sat so smugly at the curb vanished so fast it might as well have been a hallucination. And Brenda, the woman who had stalked me with cameras, buried me in violation notices, and tried to bulldoze her way into my life under a mask of authority, was stuffed into the back of a police cruiser like just another fraud. Caught red-handed. As those cuffs clicked closed, I felt something I hadn't tasted in years. Pure, undiluted satisfaction. But just as I was letting that feeling settle, Garrett gave me a look I couldn't quite shake, a mix of warning and something that felt like quiet regret. "This was the easy part," he said, voice low as he stared after the receding taillights. "The paper trail ends here, but someone paid her to push this hard. And I don't think they're finished with you yet." A chill crawled down my spine. Was this really the end, or just the calm before the next storm? Because the way Garrett said it, with that edge of certainty, made it clear. There was more to this story, and I hadn't even seen the worst of it yet. By Saturday morning, word of Brenda's arrest had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People I'd never spoken to before, neighbors who had kept their heads down and curtains drawn, were suddenly knocking on my door, desperate to know what really happened. And it turns out I wasn't the only one. Turns out Brenda's reign of fear had reached farther than I ever imagined, and I had just lit the fuse that was about to burn it all down. Smith, the sweetest elderly couple from 2 streets over, showed up the next morning with a thermos of coffee and a thick stack of violation notices that told their own painful story. They'd spent 3 years saving for a solar inverter system, only to be forced to dismantle it under one of Brenda's arbitrary rulings. Then, when they tried to run a small backup generator during a blackout, she fined them for placing it too close to the property line. Another neighbor further down the street had been cited for having motion-activated lights deemed too bright for the community's mood lighting standards. Brenda had made each family believe they were alone, that they were the only ones being non-compliant, the only ones causing problems. "We always felt something wasn't right about her," Mrs. Smith said softly, sitting at my kitchen table while her husband inspected the splintered remains of my workshop door. But we didn't know who to complain to. She was the one in charge of complaints. That was the real genius of her control. She was judge, jury, and executioner, filing, approving, and enforcing the very rules she used to torment people. And that's the thing about people like Brenda. They count on their victims feeling isolated, powerless, and too afraid to speak up. But once the news of her arrest got out, the silence broke. One by one, people started showing up, 10, 12. Visitors a day sharing horror stories of the same harassment, the same manipulation, the same helplessness. And as much as I wanted to feel part of that sudden wave of community solidarity, part of me held back. Maybe they really meant it this time. Or maybe I was just the temporary hero until the next storm rolled through. I'd seen neighborhood loyalty disappear before. Just ask anyone else Brenda had crushed before me. Still, I knew I had to do something that would last. So I repaired the workshop door, but not the usual way. I took the broken wood, the twisted electrical housing, and welded them into a steel frame. Then I bolted it to the side of the new door with a sign etched into the metal. "Boundary crossed here. Line restored." I called it the break point. It wasn't for show. And it wasn't about making some dramatic political statement. It was a reminder, for me more than anyone, that when someone crosses a line that deep, there have to be consequences. When Mrs. Peterson asked about it during one of her visits, I told her simply, "It's a reminder that not every line is invisible, and some lines, once crossed, can't ever be uncrossed." And every time I looked at that welded steel and splintered wood, I knew exactly where I stood. That memorial piece welded to my rebuilt door wasn't just a symbol of what had happened. It was a daily reminder that I finally stood up to someone who believed they could wield authority without ever being challenged. Garrett ended up staying in town longer than planned, offering support as the neighborhood worked to stabilize and recover from the chaos. As investigations deepened, it became clear this wasn't just about forged permits or bloated budgets. Garrett explained that my cabin, of all places, wasn't just a convenient hiding spot. It was actually the linchpin in a larger, carefully hidden electrical grid operation. "This goes way beyond your neighborhood," he told me as we watched. Federal agents spread out across the community, interviewing residents and collecting statements. Brenda was just a low-voltage fuse in a high-voltage circuit of corruption. That hit me in a strange way. On one hand, it meant I hadn't been singled out. My harassment wasn't personal, just opportunistic. On the other hand, it meant there were likely dozens, maybe hundreds of Brendas out there, abusing tiny pockets of authority and making life hell for ordinary homeowners under the guise of order and compliance. But things began to change quickly. The newly elected HOA board was everything Brenda's administration wasn't: transparent, cooperative, and focused on actual improvements rather than weaponized rules. They repealed all her petty aesthetic mandates, approved my electrical setup as an official addition to community infrastructure, and even moved the surveillance camera off my circuit panel to where it belonged, the main community entrance. The entire vibe of the neighborhood began to shift. People stopped whispering, started gardening again. Kids played outside without parents glancing nervously toward Brenda's old house. Slowly, the place began to feel like a community instead. of a prison with picket fences. But even with all the visible progress, I couldn't shake the unease in my gut, the sense that the worst might not be over. I'd stand at my rebuilt door, staring at the steel-framed scar with its carved words, "Boundary crossed here, line restored," and think about how all of this chaos had started with something so painfully simple, doing professional electrical work on my own property. No flags, no fights, no headlines, just a quiet commitment to build something functional. And from that small spark came a storm of aesthetic complaints, forged documents, and finally, full-scale federal charges. It made me realize that the biggest battles in life don't always begin with obvious enemies. Sometimes they start with the smallest violations of respect, of dignity, of decency. Because this didn't start with fraud. It started with power being used the wrong way. It started with a line drawn on a blueprint by someone who thought no one would ever bother to check the wiring, and from that one lazy stroke, an entire web of corruption unraveled. Looking back, I realized there was still something Garrett hadn't told me, something bigger hiding behind all the pieces he'd carefully revealed over the past few weeks. It wasn't until 3 weeks after Brenda's arrest, sitting together on my back deck sipping coffee in the early morning quiet, that he finally gave me the whole truth. He pulled out a thick folder I'd never seen before, worn edges, heavy with documents, and placed it on the table between us. "Dylan," he said, eyes locked on mine, "there's something I didn't tell you about why I really came here." The serious tone in his voice made my stomach twist. A knot of doubt tightened in my chest. Had this all been a setup? Was I just a pawn in a bigger game I never agreed to play? Garrett didn't flinch. This wasn't just about getting away. While my suspension got sorted, he continued, "We didn't just find you. We picked you." I sat back in stunned silence as he unfolded the next layer. The forgery, the fines, even Brenda. We needed someone smart enough to recognize the pattern, but not so careful they'd vanish before it unfolded. "You fit the profile." My mind reeled as he spread the contents of the folder across the patio table: blueprints, surveillance stills, financial statements, maps marked with red ink. I felt myself inching back, a reflexive withdrawal, unsure of what to say. He wasn't finished. "We chose you because you'd already lost once. We thought you'd have the resolve to stand your ground when it mattered." Then, with a deep breath, he dropped the real bombshell. This wasn't just about HOA violations. We've been tracking a multi-state fraud operation that launders public and private funding through fake infrastructure upgrades, mostly electrical, mostly invisible unless you know exactly what to look for. I stared at him, stunned, speechless. My violation notices, my shattered door, my months of harassment, they weren't just the product of petty local politics. They were part of a much deeper federal investigation into organized financial crimes operating under the camouflage of suburban bureaucracy. And somehow, I'd been the crack in the system they needed. Garrett kept talking, laying out timelines and connections, but I could barely keep up. The scope of what he showed me was staggering. This wasn't just my neighborhood, or even just Brenda. It was something massive, intricate, and hidden in plain sight, and I'd been living at the epicenter without even knowing it. Out was just one piece in a massive puzzle, one small node in a sprawling network of H.O.A. officials operating across 3 states, all tied together by an intricate web of financial fraud that reached from quiet, suburban boardrooms to high-level county government offices. Garrett laid it all out for me in sobering detail. Bank records showing millions of dollars funneled through fake contracts. Invoices paid out to shell companies for infrastructure projects that never existed, underground cabling for phantom parks, smart lighting systems that were never installed, transformer maintenance logs with no technician names or service records to match. And right in the thick of it was Brenda, using her badge of HOA authority to rubber stamp transactions that were actually channeling money into political influence schemes and laundering funds for larger, far more dangerous players. No one questions HOA spending when it's labeled as community safety or grid resilience, Garrett said, tracing his finger along a list of phony expenditures. It's the perfect paper shield. The Community Improvement Fund for electrical upgrades? Sounds noble. Emergency grid maintenance contracts? Necessary. Code compliance inspections? Expected. But when those seemingly innocent budget lines appeared in HOA ledgers across dozens of neighborhoods, each totaling just enough to avoid suspicion, what you actually had was a vast, coordinated criminal enterprise hiding in plain sight. And then, like a dam finally buckling under pressure, the full force of the truth burst through. Within 72 hours of Garrett pulling back the curtain, federal agencies launched simultaneous raids across 3 counties. The fallout was swift and surgical: 12 arrests across 3 states, homes and offices seized, entire HOA boards dismantled. Every single breadcrumb Garrett had followed over the past 18 months led to someone falling. Brenda was just the beginning. The storm she brought to my doorstep had actually uncovered something far more sinister. And now that house of cards was collapsing at full speed. What started as a broken door turned into the unraveling of a deep web of corruption that extended far beyond my neighborhood and into the very core of state-level politics. I watched in stunned silence as news reports detailed arrest after arrest, and it hit me my busted door had been the loose thread that exposed an entire criminal operation. At the center of it all was Brenda, once the smug enforcer of our HOA, faced face of a massive fraud. Her fall from grace was fast and brutal. She received 18 months in federal prison for fraud and property destruction. But that was just the beginning of her real punishment. A court ordered her to pay $47,000 in restitution to her victims, including $8,000 to me for the damage and relentless harassment. When she filed for bankruptcy and lost her home, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. But the final blow? Her mugshot printed in the HOA's last ever newsletter under a single, ironic headline: Compliance. Watching someone who once wielded so much petty power get utterly exiled by the very community she ruled was both surreal and strangely satisfying. Justice came in small, poetic doses. Neighbors crossing the street to avoid Brenda, the once feared HOA queen, now completely ostracized. It was justice, yes, but it also carried a trace of tragedy. The last anyone heard, she was working part-time at a hardware store, stationed ironically beside the conduit and breaker boxes tool she once used to control others now surrounding her as quiet reminders of what she'd lost. She visibly tenses when someone walks by in a polo and badge lanyard, flinching like every clipboard carries a subpoena. And while it's tough to pity someone who made life miserable for so many, seeing her collapse so completely makes you pause and consider just how easily authority can slide into criminality. But perhaps the most unexpected twist in this whole story was my own transformation. With the settlement money, I started a small legal aid clinic dedicated to homeowners battling electrical code harassment, fake inspections, and HOA intimidation. I mounted that scorched door in the waiting room not just as a symbol of resistance, but as a literal piece of evidence that a home can be defended with circuitry, law, and sheer determination. I never wired my house to make a stand, but somehow, it became the very place I learned to stand up for what's right. 6 months later, the entire neighborhood had changed. New HOA board, every one of Brenda's absurd rules thrown out, and in a final poetic touch, a thriving community garden planted where her house once stood. I spend my weekends there now, teaching neighbors how to set up off-grid electrical systems, how to wire panels and flip switches without fear, and most importantly, how to never be bullied by fake authority again. Hearing laughter where violation notices once echoed, standing in my weekend classroom beside that old scorched door, I'm reminded every time that ordinary people really can defeat corruption, one wire, one rule, one stand at a time. Every time I look at that old door, scorched and splintered, I'm reminded that some circuits overload, some blow out, and sometimes the ones who push too far end up learning the hard way that voltage bites back. If you've ever been cornered by people who use their power to enforce absurd, untouchable rules, just know you're not alone in that fight. There's strength in resistance, and even more in sharing these moments where justice finds a way to strike back. What's your story of standing up to people who thought they could get away with it? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, consider hitting like, subscribing, or tapping that little thanks button below. It helps keep these stories alive and seen. This is just one of many unbelievable tales, and if you're ready for more, go ahead and check out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.